Welcome back to the Unseen Podcast, a podcast dedicated to missing people, unresolved cases and UK true crime. Today we're looking at the cases of two men who were murdered within 6 months of each other in 1983 and 1984. I have wanted to cover these cases for a while, however there is a distinct lack of information about them. This has always made me feel extremely sad, as these were two very violent murders of innocent men, and the cases have some very strange similarities. I have used a Crime Watch reconstruction from 1984 as a large part of my research in this episode. As always, this episode contains descriptions that some listeners may find distressing, so listener discretion is advised. 39-year-old Stephen Sylvester worked as a taxi driver in the area close to Hounslow East tube station. He worked for a minicab company called Skyways Minicabs that was located on Kingsley Road. On the 17th of November 1983, Stephen decided to return back to the office to wait for another fare. It was around 2:30 in the morning when he got back to the office, and his other work colleagues decided to go home. It was a little quiet, and it was decided that Stephen would stay and pick up any fares that came in, and his two colleagues would go home. This was like any normal evening for Stephen. As a taxi driver, he often worked late shifts, and hanging around was also part of the job. The next day and the subsequent days after, however, it became apparent that nobody had seen Stephen. He had not returned to work, and his friends and family had also not seen him. It was clear that the last time Stephen had been seen was in the early hours of the 17th of November, when he was on his shift. The police were quickly notified about his disappearance, and they began looking for him. One thing they knew for sure is that his car was missing from the Skyways office, and therefore they began searching for that first. Initially, the police were unsure what had happened to Stephen. If he had simply driven off voluntarily, it could prove to be extremely difficult to find him. He could be anywhere after several days. It seemed important that Stephen was working at the time that he had gone missing, and the police also considered that he had picked up someone who may have wanted to harm him. As he was a taxi driver, the search area could have been huge, particularly within the London area. However, police began with the immediate area and popular places where people would usually get a taxi to. One of the places that officers decided to check was the nearby Heathrow Airport. The airport is less than 4 miles away from Kingsley Road, where Skyways Minicabs was located. Heathrow is a huge airport and of course was a popular destination for travellers to get taxis to and from. Officers decided to check the airport car parks for any sign of Stephen's car. If Stephen had decided to leave of his own accord and travel to the airport, this may also help police answer that question. On Monday the 21st of November, officers scoured the numerous car parks. They eventually checked the short-term car park at Terminal 3. This car park was only meant to be used for a short stay and to drop off. The officers quickly noticed a car that looked like Stephen's. When they checked the registration plate, they realised that they had found it. When the car was examined, however, they found a horrific sight. They found Stephen's body stuffed into the boot of his car. He had been brutally stabbed and the car had been abandoned. It was quickly apparent that the attack appeared to have taken place in the back seat, as it was covered in blood. The killer, after stabbing Stephen, had then moved his body into the boot. It was probable that this was to avoid anyone seeing it in the car park. This was not the outcome that the police or Stephen's family and friends had wanted, and it was devastating to anyone that heard what had happened to him. The police had the huge job of trying to piece together what had exactly happened in the early hours of the 17th of November. They particularly wanted to figure out what had happened after 2:30, the last time that Stephen had been seen alive. Examination of the interior of the car gave the police their first clue. They had discovered a parking ticket on the floor of the car, which appeared to indicate that it had entered the Terminal 3 car park at 4:05 a.m. The killer had had no choice but to get a ticket, as the car park was fitted with barriers at the entrance and exit. The perpetrator had then dropped this ticket on the floor of the car. This gave police somewhat of a timeline for the murder. Stephen had clearly picked up a fare in the hour after he had last been seen, and officers estimated that he may have left the office somewhere between 2:30 and 3:30 that morning. After checking the logs at the office, however, there appeared to be no record of anyone ringing up to book a taxi during this time. The question now was, where had the man gone after abandoning the car? Had he caught another taxi back towards London? Had he hitchhiked back, or was it possible that he'd even caught a flight? The police were certain that the man would have been bloodstained, and that this would have been noticeable to whoever came into contact with him. It was hoped that someone had seen something or someone suspicious that evening. There were several stumbling blocks in the investigation. The police had no lead as to who may have ordered Stephen's taxi, and they had no witnesses who saw the man leaving in the early hours of the morning. Sadly, Stephen's case grew cold over the following months. 6 months after Stephen's murder, another murder occurred that was eerily similar. Pardeep Sanga worked part-time at Blue Star Minicabs, which was located on Martindale Road, close to Hounslow West. Blue Star Minicabs was just a 10-minute drive from Skyways Minicabs, where Stephen Sylvester had worked. Pardeep worked on weekday evenings for his father-in-law. On Friday the 30th of March 1984, Pardeep was working as usual and drove back to the minicab office after one of his fares. It is reported that the Blue Star taxis didn't have radios fitted, and therefore the drivers had to return back to the office to wait for any further calls to come in. It was explained in the later Crime Watch reconstruction that it had already been a busy night for Pardeep when he returned to the office. The police were able to establish that a phone call had come into the office at around midnight from a man who wanted to be taken to Feltham. Feltham is a town around 4 miles from Hounslow. When asked where the man wanted to be picked up from, he said he was at a phone box close to some traffic lights on the Great West Road. He also said he was close to the Lambton Junction. This was around a 10-minute journey from the office. At the same time as this call came in, however, it was also known that a soldier and 2 women came into the office, and they too wanted to go to Feltham. Pardeep left the office, however the taxi logs did not say exactly which fare he had picked up first. What was known, however, was that Pardeep did not return to the office. Later on that evening at around 2 o'clock on the 31st of March, a car was noticed on the slip road just off the A30. This slip road lay right next to the perimeter fence to Heathrow Airport. The car was parked in a strange position and it was noticeably out of place. This drew attention to the car and authorities were called to investigate it. It was evident when police looked inside the car that this was a crime scene. The body of a man was found behind the passenger seat. It was Pardeep Sanga. He had been stabbed a reported 33 times. This attack was so brutal that it was difficult to imagine what kind of person had committed such a crime. When the police further examined the car, they discovered that it had actually run out of petrol, and that explained its strange position on the slip road. Police also found evidence that the killer had attempted to open the boot but was unable to. As the car had run out of petrol, they could not pull the keys out of the ignition to get the boot open. The killer appeared to have taken some of Pardeep's credit cards and some money that was on him before leaving the scene. The other mystery was, how did he leave the scene? Had he just walked away and got a lift back to London? The road close to the airport was always quite busy regardless of the time of night, and police were sure that the killer would have been spotted leaving the scene. The fact that the car was close to the airport when it had ran out of petrol also rang a lot of alarm bells for the police and the public when they heard about it. There were many similarities between Pardeep's murder and Stephen's murder. The fact that both cars were abandoned at the airport or close to the airport was one of them. Had the killer been trying to get to one of the airport car parks when the car ran out of petrol? Both men had been brutally stabbed multiple times, and the killer in Pardeep's case had attempted to open the boot, which is where Stephen's body had been placed. They were also most noticeably taxi drivers who were working in the early hours. In the Crime Watch episode, another possible connection between the two men was discussed. Both men were from a black, Asian and minority ethnic background, and it was speculated on the show whether that could have been a possible motive or contributing factor as to why these men were chosen by the killer. The cases were almost identical, and the police treated them as though they may have been committed by the same perpetrator. The investigations, however, did not have much to go on in terms of witnesses or evidence. Investigators searched both cars thoroughly and the areas around where they had been left. They uncovered several weapons which they believed were used in the attacks. A replica of an English commando knife was found in Stephen's car underneath the front passenger seat. This was not Stephen's knife, and the police believed that it belonged to the killer. A bunch of keys that appeared to be for a clock were found at the back of Stephen's car. The police were unsure if these were related in any way to the murder. In Pardeep's case, a search along the road uncovered another knife, this time a US Army trench knife. This had been left behind a junction box 2¼ miles away from the car. Forensic examination of the knife confirmed that this weapon had been used to kill Pardeep. Pardeep was a Sikh, and police were able to confirm that his ceremonial dagger called a kirpan had been taken from him after his murder. The police showed a similar dagger on the Crime Watch episode, however Pardeep's had an orange band around it. The episode aired in October 1984, and the police appealed for anyone with information to come forward. They stressed that the man would have been very bloody after these attacks, and would have stood out if he had been seen. On the episode it was explained that they may be looking for a tall man, however did not elaborate as to how they knew this. It may have been from the position of the seat when the cars were found, although that is just my speculation. Sadly, no leads came in to help with the investigations, and it has never been reported that any suspects were interviewed or arrested in relation to Stephen or Pardeep's murders. Several articles and reports that I have read cited another case that occurred in the 80s as being quite similar to the other two murders. While this murder has never been linked with the other two, there are features of the crime which are shared between all three. In the early hours of Saturday the 14th of August 1982, 33-year-old Gurcharn Singh Landa, who was also known as John, was working as a taxi driver in the central Midlands city of Nottingham. The taxi company had received a call from a phone box before 4 a.m. John answered the call and travelled out to Peel Street in the city centre. The caller had given his name as Shelton when he had spoken to an operator. It's known that John travelled to the address before then driving to Cyrus Road, just over a mile away. It was on Cyrus Road that a woman who lived there reported hearing a car brake loudly outside her house at around 4:05 a.m. She looked out of her window to see what was happening and saw a taxi outside. It was rocking from side to side as though a fight was taking place inside it, and it looked as though someone was searching the dashboard. The woman quickly rang 999 to alert the police, and she dashed outside to see what was going on. When she arrived, she found John, who was still alive, but it was evident he had been stabbed multiple times. Sadly, just after police arrived at the scene, John passed away. It would later be discovered that he had been stabbed 87 times while he was in the car. Police set out on a huge investigation, as there was no real evidence as to who the perpetrator was. It was clear that it must have been the person who rang up to ask for a taxi, but the killer had escaped the car before the witness had come out of her house. Over the course of the investigation in 1982, 2,000 statements were taken and over 13,000 people were spoken to. Unlike Stephen and Pardeep's investigations, 11 people were either arrested or interviewed under caution in relation to John's murder, however nobody was ever charged. As I've said, these crimes have never been linked, however there are some striking similarities. All three men were taxi drivers, all three were from a black, Asian or minority ethnic background. It is believed that all three men answered a call to pick the killer up, and all three had been brutally stabbed in their taxis within a 3-year period. One notable difference, of course, was that John's murder took place in Nottingham and not in London. John's family were absolutely devastated by his murder. He had a very large family and was the father of 8 children. In 2012, an appeal was put out by both the police and his family to try and drum up any fresh leads. The family appealed and talked about their father, with John's eldest daughter saying to the BBC, "The detectives came around and my world came crashing down around me. 30 years on and I'm married with 3 children. My dad missed all this." Detective Chief Inspector Tony Hayden from Nottingham Police appealed to anyone that may have information. He said in his appeal to the public, "Mr. Landa's death not only devastated a family, but shocked an entire community. 30 years have passed, but justice still needs to be done, and someone could have vital information that would help us to identify the person or people responsible for Mr. Landa's murder." He then added, "Take a moment to cast your mind back. Your own view may have changed. You may have been told something after the incident that could help us, or you may know someone who may have information. What you know could be the final piece of the jigsaw." This appeal sadly could apply to any of the 3 murders, John's, Pardeep's or Stephen's. It is difficult to say whether any of these crimes are connected. As I've said, there is a lack of information in the public about all 3 of them. It is fair to say that there are many similarities between them. It is also relevant to say that all 3 murders were so unnecessary and sad. I would love it if this episode jogs someone's memory, and if that is the case, I would urge you to contact police. I want to see these cases solved for the families of all of these innocent victims. This episode is dedicated to Stephen, Pardeep and John. Thank you for listening to today's episode, and thank you to our patrons. If you would like to support us, you can do by supporting us on Patreon or just reviewing the podcast wherever you listen. If you have any suggestions for any cases you want to see covered, please contact me on social media on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, or email me at theunseenpod@gmail.com. I am so happy to celebrate 2 years of the podcast this weekend, and I'm so proud of what we've all achieved. Thank you so much to everyone who has listened over the past 2 years. I appreciate you all so much. I put out posts on social media which ask listeners to reply. Thank you to these people as well as everyone else who I know also listens. Wayne Cross, Chet Alley, The Stricken Land, Lady Justice Podcast and Lisa Marie from Twitter. Simon, Rebecca and Electra Lockheed on Instagram. And Paula, Barbara, Lara, Jackie and Catherine on Facebook. Thank you also to these people for your kind congratulations messages. Phil and Rob on Facebook, Melanie, Kitchen Table Historian, Just Jan, Sinead from the Men's Ria podcast on Instagram, and Emily from the Morbidology podcast, and Ben from They Walk Among Us. I'm so proud of the podcast and I couldn't have done it without all of you, so thank you. Listen to the end today for a promo from a great podcast from Minna at True Crime Finland. I honestly love this podcast and I'm sure you will too. Minna tells a great story and she is also lovely, helping me in the past with some very helpful suggestions for my upcoming trip to Japan. Please have a listen. Once again, thanks for listening, and as always, I'm Caprice and this has been Unseen.
Hi, this is Minna from True Crime Finland. Finland, so peaceful and quiet. There isn't even any crime there, right? Wrong. Join me every 2 weeks in discovering the dark side of the land of 1,000 lakes. From the legendary and infamous to the lesser known and forgotten cases, find True Crime Finland wherever you get your podcasts.